Welcome to Unnumbered. I'm your host, Dr. Amy, lifestyle medical doctor, speaker, and coach. I'm here to remind you that you are unique, rare, and one of a kind, and so is your health. So be prepared to be educated, inspired, and empowered to live a healthy and purposeful life. Awesome. So today we have the privilege of having Dr. Sam Douglas on the podcast. He is a true visionary in the world of psychedelics and ethics. Dr. Sam has a PhD in philosophy and over a decade of experience in teaching, research, and professional ethics. Dr. Sam brings a unique perspective to our discussion, but that's not all. He's a dedicated advocate in Australia's psychedelic community for more than 20 years, serving as the president of the Australian Psychedelic Society and playing a key role in the founding of the Ethical Psychedelic International Community. Beyond advocacy, Dr. Sam also runs his own psychedelic content business and collaborates with different global platforms. So you are a wealth of knowledge, and I am super excited to introduce you, Sam. So Dr. Sam Douglas, hello. How are you today? I did just ask you this question.
You did. I'm well. I'm well. The sun is shining. I can kind of see out my window because the tomatoes are just kind of taking over. That my vegetable garden is kind of infringing on my view out of my office. But yeah, I'm good.
I just had to ask you that because just before we pressed record, I said to Sam, "How are you going?" And he gave this kind of like startled look as to say, like, how do you answer that exactly? And I suppose I completely forgot that you study philosophy and ultimately that means really deep, really interesting conversation. So I'm so glad that we started off on this on this footing.
Yeah, look, I try to, I have been involved with academic philosophy for a long time, and I feel like sometimes it limits my ability to just answer normal questions like a normal person. It's like, how are you today? It's like, well, what do you mean by you? And how? Yeah. Look, also, thank you so much for the lovely introduction. I think, I don't think that special. I think, but yes, it's really great to be here. It's really, I love talking about philosophy. I love talking about psychedelics, and yeah, you'll just have to try and stop me. I want to.
Yeah. Oh well, we can run with everything that you want to talk about, Sam. So Dr. Sam, tell us a bit. Let's start from kind of where we've talked about is sometimes it's quite hard to answer questions in plain old English. And a lot of people in the psychedelic realms who have experienced psychedelics or are working with people in a psychedelic-assisted therapies, often people will say that they can't actually explain their experiences. They're infallible. They're not something that is in a dictionary, or they're not something that they've seen before. It's not something that they're able to explain in simple terms because of how deep sometimes their experiences are. Can you kind of tell us a bit about why that is, and how exactly can we try and formulate some gap between these experiences that are indescribable to something in a way in which we can actually try to converse with people?
Yeah, look, I think that this is an area where there's probably a range of explanations depending on what kind of angle you come at it from. So I'm a philosopher. I actually did my PhD in philosophy of language. My PhD was about why some words mean particular things and not something else. What does the word cat point to, like the little four-legged furry things, and not something else? Like I wrote like 80,000 words on that. Looking back, I'm not sure why I did this, but this is an area that I know fairly well. So from my perspective, it's that part of it is to do with how language works. Like when things are like you pick up language, you pick up what words attach to what things, you pick up what things are called. But once you're past a certain age, you're never really dealing with anything that's absolutely new. Like, so you might see an animal that you've never seen before. You might see a tiger. You've never seen a tiger before, but you're and someone else, you'll say, what's that? And someone will, well, that's a tiger. People will tell you, that's the big cat with the stripes, that's dangerous. But chances are that you're already got some kind of other words and other language that's kind of a scaffolding for that. So you might not have ever seen a tiger before, and you might not be familiar with the specific concept of tiger, but you might have seen cats before. So you have something to attach it to, or even if not cats, then you're familiar with animals or four-legged animals or mammals or something like that. So you have other concepts that you can kind of put together to make, tiger. You go cat, it's bigger than a cat, and it's more dangerous, but and so you can kind of construct something as an adult, or even as a child. But when you're really young and you're learning language from scratch, you don't have this same kind of scaffolding. You're learning everything from kind of basics, and there's arguments around how much innate language we have or not, or how much innate kind of concepts that we're kind of born with. And I don't think that that's really settled in the science, but we know it's not a lot. Now, as adults, we have largely forgotten what it's like to see things really that you've never seen before, or see things pure, like completely anew. So I think that we see things and we don't have any of that other kind of linguistic or conceptual scaffolding or building blocks to put things together. And even worse, if it's a thing where other people haven't had those experiences. So you can't even really, it's hard to even talk to other people about it. But what's interesting is that we've seen over time is that the language kind of catches up. So when people, when Terence McKenna talked about self-replicating machine elves, that the beings, the entities that he encountered, using DMT. Now, like he gave this, that he sort of had this term, and then people had like an idea, like here's, we've put these words together, and now we have kind of we have a kind of a label to stick on things that happen, these particular kind of things, or these particular experiences of these sort of beings that people might encounter under these circumstances. And then it kind of goes from there. And now there's a whole conversation, there's a whole argument about whether or not machine elves and things that you encounter in these kind of places, whether or not they actually really exist, and we can put that to one side. But there's now more of a conversation around, like, people talk about the different things that happen to them, different beings they've encountered in kind of DMT space. And so we're kind of building that language up now. So you're still having these really wild experiences, and it takes you a while to grapple with them. But now you can talk to other people, and it's like, was it the machine elves? Was it a jester-like entity? Was it kind of like the praying mantis kind of guys, things like this. And so there's it's like your language sort of catches up over time. But yeah, it is really hard when you're having these experiences and there's just nothing to attach them to. But it's also that I think, and I've experienced this, is that even things that are normal, really mundane, normal things, like psychedelics can just something to do with what's happening in your brain at the time just can really interfere with what feels familiar, or what feels kind of, what you have the concepts for. I have a little story about that, if I can tell it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so the first time I took LSD, which was many years ago, I will, and therapy, integration. I didn't even know what integration was. No one talked about this stuff, in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. Anyway, I had gone to a party that, friend of a friend, party. I took some LSD that I procured there, and was just sitting around outside on a veranda. A bunch of people, just, everyone was tripping. And, for a couple of us, it was our first time, but everyone was very nice. But there was a bunch of us sitting around a table, just sitting around our table, passing around a joint, out on this person's veranda that I just met, that night. And we're sitting out there, and as the LSD is coming on, it kind of snuck up on me, as it does. And then, I'm like, yeah, okay, now it's something's happening. And then we just kept talking. And then suddenly at some point, I look across the table at this guy that I'd met like a couple of hours ago. And there was just something wrong, and I couldn't understand, not wrong, but something I couldn't understand what was happening. And I'm looking, I'm like, there's something, what is it? What is this thing on your arm? I don't understand, and I'm just having this internal kind of monologue that I'm looking at this guy's arm, and I couldn't just, it's like this thing, and I had no words, and I didn't know what was happening. So after, just staring for minutes, and no one had noticed anything at this, up until this point. After a while, I get up and I walk around the table, and I go right up to his arm. So I'm, right, sort of like a foot away from his arm. I'm staring at this thing on his arm, and at this point, of course, conversation is completely stopped. Everyone is just looking at me. What is this dude doing? And I just turn to this guy, and I'm like, whisper, I'm like, what is this thing on your arm? And he said, mate, that's my watch. And then I went, oh, yeah, you're right, it is. And then, kind of died of embarrassment. But yeah, like it was this thing, and I had just kind of lost the whole concept, and my brain was just, how is this thing? How is it attached? So it was a really, really strange experience. It was the start of a whole string of strange experiences that evening, but it's one that's really stuck with me, to like see something just like it's a wristwatch. It's like a watch. Everyone knows what a watch is, but just for 5-10 minutes, I didn't. And it's a thing that I come back to like a lot. It's a thing that I think about if I'm trying to kind of get myself in a mindset to sort of approach things like with an open mind, or approach things anew. We'll try and remember what it's, because we forget as adults what it's like to really, like, when do you ever see anything really new? When do you ever have a really novel experience where you just, your brain, that feeling of amazement, I think is your brain working really hard. Like there's something new happening, so we got to deal with this, yeah. Anyway, it was a really interesting experience, but yeah, just
it,
even for
it's
something
so
normal,
cool.
yeah, it's just, yeah.
It's really interesting, because I would also say, there's another flip side to psychedelics that I personally have experienced, where something that we may know, like you mentioned, like a watch for you, it's that you lost the ability to understand what its use is in normal 3D world. But for me, sometimes it's that things have extra meanings. So there's a lot of like serendipity or deja vu-ness to my world on psychedelics, that sometimes I add extra meaning to things that I never would have thought of. It's almost like sometimes my normal life is very superficial, but then in the psychedelic world, they're just, I seem to attach a lot of meaning or attributes to something that may seem quite plain, like a plain object. It may start to have a lot of substance to it. So I like to see it from both angles. I've not had it so much the other way that you described. So that's super interesting.
It's
Yeah.
It's only happened to
So
me
I mean,
once, so it stands out,
yeah, yes. I mean, you've obviously been working in this field for a long time. How do you, you create content and you talk about this, and it's particularly in psychedelics and the kind of philosophy of it. Like, how do you form content when there's so little language around the way in which we can describe these experiences? Are you going mainly off what observationally you hear from people and then connecting the dots, or are you doing it from personal experience, like you were mentioning about Terence McKenna? Are you finding that there's eventually these links that you're able to join, and then you're finding, okay, there's some common threads that people see in psychedelics? What do you do, and what do you find?
I think I think you kind of have to take, you kind of have to do all of the above. I think. I mean, I draw really heavily on my personal experiences, because they're really, um, Well, I don't know. I think you understand what I mean when I say it's hard. I can't not. I've had these experiences, and it's just impossible to. I kind of can't put them, you know, to one side entirely when I'm writing about these things. But I think, uh, which is good. I think there's an expectation. It's my personal belief that you're a better writer about psychedelics if you've had some psychedelic experience. It's kind of a pet thing of mine when people have come to me and say, I'd love, I'd love to work with you. I'd love to, do you need someone to do some, do you need someone to write for you? And I'll say, right, I need to see, an example of your writing where you write about your, a psychedelic experience that you've had, and I need to read that and really believe it and feel it. And that's a thing that a lot of people find difficult. But I think it really, it helps kind of come across and be authentic, to have had these experiences. I draw heavily on them, but I think in order to really reach people, yeah, you look for the common threads. You look for because we have these really wild experiences, and they're wild. People have these things that are very different, but also people tend to have they're in amongst all the amazing difference and variety of psychedelic experiences. The sort of common themes come through in certain areas, and it's themes around how you feel about yourself, how you feel in relation to the world. It might be in DMT the common thread is really kind of these otherworldly kind of hyperspatial experiences and entity encounters. So it's in different ways you pick up these kind of common threads. I think in writing about them, because it's, I guess in some ways, psychonauts are, in some ways, it depends on your audience. Like you can write in a way where people read something different, but also people like to have their experience kind of reflected back to them. And because one of the things that comes out of psychedelic experience when you're not in a group of people, or you're not in a community of people who are having it, it can feel kind of lonely and isolating. You've had this amazing thing has happened. Your view of the world, or your view of what might be real, what might be possible, is completely kind of blown apart. But maybe your friends and family that you have most contact with, they haven't been there. So when you try and talk to them about it, they don't understand, or they think that you're crazy or something. So it's nice to write in a way that people can go, yeah, I've been there.
Mm.
And then you have that kind of connection and kind of build sort of rapport and community through that shared experience.
It's interesting. I actually have a friend that whenever I've sat with psychedelics, if she's been there, she often writes like an essay, like literally a journal, and she'll often send me her report essentially of her experience. And it's interesting because in those times I've also been sitting, and I have no interest in anyone else's experience, because I am actually so trying to integrate what's actually occurred for myself, let alone try and hear about someone else's experience. But I find that the feedback from her is that people who haven't experienced psychedelics really enjoy reading, so that they get some little tiny teasers, or try to understand actually what it feels like without actually doing the experience themselves, for whatever reason that may be, right? Because one, many psychedelics are not legal in Australia, and two, a lot of people can't travel to the places where it is legal. And I mean that brings up something. Most psychedelics here in Australia are illegal. Obviously, at the moment, we only have medicinal cannabis, which isn't actually prescribed for psychedelic experiences. But I suppose it's an indirect thing that sometimes people do experience with cannabis when they hold a strong intention, and they're being very present and potentially creating some form of ritual for themselves. They do express that. How do you manage to work in the psychedelic field when there's a lot of red tape? It's technically illegal in this country. How are you finding navigating that, and even discussing psychedelics even in such a space?
Look, it can be a challenge. I think I've been lucky in that with the way that I guess trajectory of my career has progressed has been really heavily influenced by the people that I've worked with in the US, where there's a little bit more kind of leeway, or the barriers there, they're different kinds of barriers than the ones we might have here. But yeah, it can be tricky. I think part of it is that, yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna have to think about how I answered this question now. I guess,
I
yeah,
don't mean to
yeah.
put you on the
No,
spot,
no,
but it's a
no. I'm
difficult
thinking
one,
it is a
right?
difficult one.
Like,
Look, I'll be honest, it has, not everyone is into it. A lot of people are really good about it. Not everyone is. I have lost, there've been opportunities sort of outside of psychedelics, sort of in academia and education that I'm pretty sure that I've lost because of my kind of public advocacy and work around this. I mean, we all get used to in working around certain practicalities where we either, you know, people talk about their psychedelic experiences. They're always overseas where it's legal, or they're always a very long time ago, or you never say, exactly, where or when or who and you never say who you were with. So these things that we get used to doing, and particularly having worked in sort of the harm reduction spaces, like with the Australian Psychedelic Society, we spend a lot of time kind of coaching people on how to talk about what's the safe way to talk about these things, even just the basic safety, which is, how to discuss, if you've had these experiences, how to best discuss them in ways that are less likely to, end up with you coming to sort of, getting the wrong kind of attention from the wrong sort of people for them. Yeah, so I mean, I'm used to that. I think you just have to, you have to be careful what you say to people, and then you just have to understand that not everyone's going to like it. I think we have a lot less difficulty here. I know people in the US where they'll be running, legitimate psychedelic businesses, but they can't, their business name, you can't mention anything to do with psychedelics, because then no bank will, process your payments, or you can't even open a bank account for your business if you have the wrong thing in the business name. So that doesn't appear to have been a problem here, but it's just different barriers in different places. It's just something to kind of approach with caution, but always, with regard to specific experiences and specific, things that you've done, or things that other people have done, it's just being, prudent with what you kind of disclose. Is just,
yes.
It's just part of the territory, part of the field at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And so how do you see the future with psychedelics in Australia in particular, taking from some of the fact that places like Denver has 5 psychedelics that are currently legal, and multiple other countries around the world. Like, where do you see Australia going? Obviously you're aware of the MDMA and psilocybin mushroom changes from the 1st of July with psychiatrists. What do you think? What do you see happening, and where do you feel that the field's going to land?
It's a really tricky question. I think that in terms of therapeutic access, I think it will take time to grow, but I think it will. But it's not going to be fast, and we can kind of, this is going to be like back when we started with medicinal cannabis, but slower. It's going to be like that. It's going to be slow and tedious and bureaucratic and all of these things. Further from that, what might kind of open up over time, I would hope that there's more reform kind of outside of the clinical space, or both kind of at the edge of it, so that it's not just something that's not so tightly controlled just by psychiatrists. And I think there's room for that. And the discussions that I'm hearing coming through with people who are, psychologists and social workers who are interested in working with psychedelics and working with clients, using psychedelics, people in those areas who are in discussions with kind of the psychiatric establishment, I think that over time there will be room to move in that direction. I think things will kind of loosen up a bit. But I also hope that there can kind of be some sort of sensible moving away from treating, psychedelics. There's a problem with how we deal with all drugs, whether it's psychedelic or not, in our society at the moment. And it's such a no-brainer to me that being, facing really serious legal trouble for having gone and picked, some mushrooms out of a cow paddock. It's just insane to me that we're still in that position now. So I would hope over time we can get some progress on that as well, which is something that's kind of separate to psychedelic therapy. People kind of lump them together, but it's two very different things going on here, and they don't necessarily relate, though they, legalization movements tend to have tended to coincide with medicinal access to things, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk that just because something's medically available that it'll become more legal. So yeah, I hope that we move in that direction. I know a lot of people are putting a lot of effort into moving us in that direction, but you've got a lot of well-meaning but very, I think, conservative kind of forces that are sort of stacked up against this thing. You have kind of mainstream medical and psychiatric establishments. You have sort of people who aren't really familiar with these things and maybe don't know kind of the full story on how useful psychedelics can be, but also how relative, if used in the right way, in a good setting, with good preparation, how the risk that they pose to people's well-being isn't really proportional to how they're treated under the law. All of this stuff people aren't aware of. So it's just going to take time to kind of bring people around. And if you bring enough people around, then eventually the politicians will follow, who will always be the last to the party. But once they figure that there's enough votes in it, then they'll go along with it as well, as they always do in the end. But it's a lot of, as anyone who's followed the kind of arc of medicinal cannabis in Australia knows, it's just a really long, slow process to get progress in these sort of areas.
I mean, I was just talking to a colleague just before, Dr. Nick, about this kind of process, and we were kind of comparing medicinal cannabis with America, and in fact, both of us were in agreement that we're actually really innovative in that we are bridging the gap between that kind of personal use and medicinal, and I do kind of see that as well with psychedelics. That it's like a double-edged sword. There needs to be the safety, there needs to be the harm reduction, there needs to be the set and the setting, but there also needs to be the practices of native traditions. There needs to be the practices of intention and not using this just as a recreational thing. And in your education, you when you're writing about psychedelics, are you often sharing? I mean, there's always two sides to everything, right? And people will have bad journeys and they'll have good journeys. Do you find that you share everything, or do you find that there's a bit of bias that people who take psychedelics are just like, way, everyone should do psychedelics, give it to all the politicians? Do you feel like there's sometimes a little bit of that there isn't always a balance in everyone's thinking, and it's either yes or no, and actually we just need to kind of come more into bridging where we actually are rather than just going one or the other?
Yeah, look, I think there can be a bias. I think this I think a lot of people kind of go through this as a phase, particularly when you've just discovered psychedelics. It can be really easy to start telling everyone that they should be doing it and thinking, things which really on reflection is just not a great idea. It's like, we'll give all the politicians psychedelics and then everything will be fine. I'm fairly sure that's not true. And I'm pretty sure if you stop and think about it, you would agree. But yeah, look, I try and, when I've done work with other organizations and in my own writing, I try and keep things balanced. I think challenging experiences happen, and I think I've been lucky in that some of the challenging experiences I've had happened when I didn't have support. I didn't have, we didn't have practices. This was, this is before the discussion around preparation and integration was a thing. So, you just kind of had to, just try and sort of shrug it off and work through it. And yeah, this, like, if you're lucky, and for most people, even with the challenging experience, you'll probably be fine. But it's not like that for everyone, and it's really important to admit that, to be clear that it's not like that for everyone, and talk about safety, and talk about down to just, what kind of environment, should you be aiming to be in? Who should you be with? Do you know these people? Do you, are they trustworthy? Yeah, but, you've got to be able to trust them with your well-being in a really kind of profound way. Yeah, lots of stuff. The one that I was really happy that a while ago a company had asked me to write a bit about was psychedelics and schizophrenia. Like, do you have a family history? Like, not necessarily yourself, but does any direct family member of yours have schizophrenia? Like, if the answer to that is yes, don't take psychedelics. It's probably a bad idea. Like, because you're already just statistically probably at a higher risk of developing it, and so, we don't know for sure what the links are between psychedelics and some of these really serious mental illnesses, but just for the sake of caution, you might decide on balance that maybe to take a different approach. So having these conversations is really important, and but also not kind of holding up, for most people, you don't need to hold up challenging experiences as something to be like, to treat with real fear or kind of revulsion. They can be, they're not easy, but they can be really rewarding. Even just the feeling of having I mean, personally, I think the feeling of having come out the other side of if you can come out of a really challenging experience where you feel, really, uncomfortable and bad. And I've had, some of those, and in some ways, my own fault, because I should have known that I wasn't in the right headspace. And even just, practical things like, what have you eaten this, in the evening before you decide that maybe you should have some magic mushrooms? They do not combine well in your stomach with, huge amounts of junk food, I've discovered. And then you're, really bad stomach ache and plus mushrooms. You're probably not in for a fun time. Purging, wild tripping. Some people are okay with this. I am not one of them. But if you can come out of the other side of an experience that is challenging, then, like, there's kind of a certain sense of accomplishment to it.
It's interesting. It's interesting about that you mentioned about schizophrenia and psychedelics, because I was only reading literally like this week about the history of LSD, which is acid, for those people that don't know what LSD is. So LSD allows you to see with your eyes open visually, things kind of move and get bigger or come alive. And so the only way I can describe it to those that have never taken it, if you were to sit on like a weaved mat, for example, that's just got normal straw weave through it, if you were to just stare at the blanket or the rug that you're sitting on, for me, an experience I had, it came alive like the ocean. So I could see all the weaves, the intricacy of the straw, and it was moving. And when I was reading about LSD earlier this week in the history of LSD, it was talking about how medical doctors in the 1900s, something, I don't know, I have to try and find the dates, but it was talking about how doctors took LSD to have a feeling or were able to relate to what it must feel like to be schizophrenic, to have a psychosis. And I found that so enriching and enlightening for myself, because it was a way in which we were, in those times, in which we were able to form some unity in the way that those patients or people see life. Because as a doctor, or I'm not a psychiatrist, but as a doctor and someone trying to explain how they see things or what they see, it can feel so abstract. It can feel so alien that you have no concept or similarities to people speaking. But like this book was mentioning, and like the way that I have felt, it gives you this understanding of how scary and how it can almost form a loop in people's head, you know, a constant memory or a constant nightmare, an occurrence that occurs. It's similar to like PTSD. So I find that fascinating, you know, that in those times we were innovative enough as doctors, as health professionals, to go, hey, what's it feel like? Okay, let's take LSD and try it out. Whereas now, obviously, it's illegal to take LSD. We know that LSD is also on the next list after MDMA and psilocybin. We know that it's next for possible prescription through a psychiatrist. I mean, how far away do you think we are with that? Maybe what, 2-3 years, or?
I think it's a matter of where. I think, you know, we'd have to be at least, you know, I would imagine it will be at least a couple of years here before it's kind of onto the same point. It would be nice to see some of these things open up, because I think things like LSD and DMT and mescaline, you know, they are different to psilocybin and MDMA, but they're also, I think, with the, you know, they're all potentially useful. I think that yeah, it would be nice to see these things kind of move forward. And it is really interesting that I remember, like, because before the term psychedelic was coined, people used to refer to LSD as, and psilocybin as, I think, psychomimetic, a thing that mimics the effect of you know, of psychiatric illness. And yeah, like, I don't know how accurate, like, you know, it is. I don't know how much it is like, you know, really, you know, experiencing schizophrenia, but it was interesting to think that we would kind of, people would go, yeah, we should try this. It's interesting to note, though, that as kind of a caution, and I don't know if people thought about it then, but I think about it now, and people have pointed this out to me when I've gotten a bit overexcited with talking about this stuff, that because there's this kind of debate now with, like, should psychiatrists who are prescribing psilocybin, should they have had the experience? And what you were saying makes me think about this, where, you know, you can have this experience, but your experience is your experience. You know, your experience of psilocybin is yours, and it's not going to be, you know, the same as someone you're treating. It's not going to be the same as you know, your friend who's taken it. So there's always, like, it kind of gives you an insight, but we always need to, I feel like we always need to sort of remember, like, that our experiences of these things are all different, and not, because that's the other thing that happens when people kind of get over enthusiastic. And again, I'm sure I'm guilty of this. It's like, I had an awesome time doing this, therefore, you know, everyone will. Well, no, you know, or I did this, and you know, I took LSD, and you know, I, you know, largely stopped drinking alcohol, you know, for quite a long time afterwards. Happens for a lot of people, doesn't happen for everyone. So it's just not kind of assuming that your experience is going to be the same as everyone else's is kind of an important thing through this.
Yeah,
But it's
I
really
completely agree.
it's such an interesting kind of area.
And it is, it's absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, with the work that you do, are you mainly educating? So just explain to me a bit more. So your content, right, is that writing and helping with kind of policies and procedures in psychedelic? And obviously you were the have you stepped down from the president of the
I finished up as president in the Psychedelic Society in August. I'd done that for 2 years. I've been vice president for a year before that, and I've been on the national executive for, you know, the year before that. And I'm still on the executive, but I just needed a rest, you know. It's a lot. It's a real lot, and you know, it's a volunteer position, so it's a real lot, because you're doing it on top of working.
Wow. And what's the aim of the Australian Psychedelic Society and a lot of the things that you're writing for? Is it mainly to educate so people have an understanding? Is it mainly harm reduction? What's your main form of work headed towards?
done just a lot of different stuff. I think a lot of it is harm reduction and education. I think 90% of the work that I've done, either as like paid work for my own business, or stuff that I'd written for the Psychedelic Society, or things just our overall aims with the Psychedelic Society. A lot of it was around education and harm reduction. I mean, ultimately, my volunteer work was around, you know, is around health and health promotion. It's around sort of people are going to use psychedelics. Well, how do we, and that kind of harm reduction approach. We know people are going to do this, so we're just going to put to one that we're not going to tell them not to, because no one's listening to that. And given that people are going to do this, well, how are we going to make this, how do we make this as safe as possible? How do we make this as beneficial as possible? And I think a lot of the paid work that I've done over the years has been kind of along those lines too. Some of it is, I particularly some of the articles that I did for Third Wave when I started writing, it was really cool because I kind of get these briefs where they would encourage me to sort of explore the implications of research that was coming out, and still doing it in a safe way, but kind of going, oh well, look, this has been, so what if we can kind of generalize from something that's been said, and maybe there's think about different ways that psychedelic research might go in the future. And what was really funny was that one of the first things that I wrote for Third Wave was just a blog post about talking about research on psychedelics, and this was LSD, and chronic pain, and how psychedelics might be able to, because there's a paper suggesting that there might be a way that you could use psychedelics to help treat chronic pain, because they make your brain more adaptable. You sort of increase your neuroplasticity, so you can create new pathways in your brain, and that's really important for working around chronic pain, because chronic pain, as creates these pathways in your brain where it's just, I mean, you're really experiencing the pain, but your brain is kind of wired to experience the pain, and to deal with chronic pain, you're kind of trying to work around that, so it's really difficult. But yeah, they'd asked me to write this blog post, and I kind of speculated a bit about that. And then years later, now people are doing research on LSD and psychedelics and chronic pain, for those exact reasons, because it's just allows you to think around things. I think the mechanism's still kind of undiscovered so far. But there was that one paper, apparently low dose of LSD, you just don't feel particular kinds of pain as much, which no one's really sure why, but it's a cool thing. But yeah, so I did get to do some of that, but a lot of my writing has just been around, if you're going to microdose, if you're going to do this, if you're what's your ideal setting, what are the kind of things you need to think about if you're going to do this, it's really interesting. It's been really kind of rewarding work over the last couple of years.
Do you have a particular setting for yourself, or do you tend to find that you prefer in groups or a single? What tends to be things that you found that work for you?
I tend to prefer quieter settings. I'm not a big one for really sort of large groups of people or very loud places. Natural environments, are nice, but also, but it doesn't have to be much. It can just be, if it's in a place where, it's not necessarily, out in the middle of nowhere, but it's somewhere rural, so you can at least, sit out and
At the stars.
Sit out and look at the stars. I'm a huge fan of, out, being somewhere outdoors, where you can sit around a fire with people, and not a huge bunch of people, but it's I think if people are on, again, it depends on who you're with. If everyone's kind of on the same wavelength, even if they're not all having a psychedelic experience, if they've had one before, then they know how to be around people who are having that experience. And that's a thing that I picked up very early, because I discovered in my 20s, a number of times I ended up as a kind of accidental trip sitter for other people. you know, at parties because they'd taken some acid and were having a bad time. And I was sober, but because I'd been there, I could go, right, okay, well, how are you feeling? What are we going to do? You know, let's go and sit outside, or let's, you know, let's come in, let's sit you down, let's watch some cartoons on TV, and you know, just everything's going to be fine. This is also what taught me that
Cartoons might freak them out.
yeah, I know. Look, you just keep trying different things, and one of them will eventually work,
Yeah.
or they'll you know, the experience will finish up. You know, this is also what taught me that I didn't want to be a professional trip sitter, but you know,
Psychedelic assisted therapist.
yeah,
Yeah.
no. I don't need that level of responsibility.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's just, you know, a nice, you know, I just, I said, nice, relaxed outdoor setting, you know, hanging out with some people that you know that you're comfortable with, um, you know, and you know, just, but also like things can give you, you know, it's a certain level of security. Like you know, you're around people, you know. Also, there's at least one sober person, so if someone actually needs to pick up the phone or do something really like
Mm,
complicated that
mm,
requires, you know, a kind of
mm,
a normal brain that you know, someone is you know, capable of doing it. Yeah, I don't think it
mm,
has to be anything kind of fancy. I've
mm.
not had yeah, not had a lot of experiences that I felt ever really required much more than that. I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's just, but it's nice to be, you know, like that. And sometimes I've sat with people who are like, I mean, it's certainly early on, I sat with people who are a lot more experienced than me when trying things for the first time. And I think that's really nice to have someone who's really experienced and just really calm and grounded, and
Mm,
just go, yeah, you know, you'll be fine.
mm.
You know,
It it's
yeah.
it's so important because even just recently there's like just going to different festivals myself, just seeing the amount of tents that there are with like harm reduction tents. So you know, understanding the landscape of psychedelics is quite wide, and it's you know, it's illegal but it's still occurring, right? And some people choose to do that in different sets and settings. I personally don't. I'm similar to you. I prefer something way more cozy and natural. But this is occurring, you know, out in different parties and festivals and things. And to see that there's tents where people are able to go when they are having a bad journey. And I hate the word trip because it just, to me, it does give that more recreational feel. I love the word like journey because I feel like people are going on a journey, whether it's good or bad, you know, whatever they're faced with. It's a journey in itself. But you know, you mentioned about you're not keen to be one of those sitters or psychedelic assisted therapies. What kind of qualities do you think it requires of someone to be able to be quite grounded and sit with someone that's having a bad journey, and it may be quite frightening to people that know nothing about psychedelics, who see that in their friend or in a family member? What qualities are needed for someone to help someone like that as a therapist?
Well, look, I think it depends what you mean by you know, depends what you mean by help. But I think in the first instance, in terms of just sitting with people, I think, and particularly sitting with people who are having a hard time, uh, I mean, you need to be. I imagine it's quite nice to have had training and you know, supervised kind of experience so that you can come to this not feeling you're being thrown in the deep end, and not, you know, and you know, it'd be different. It'd be different for me doing it now, but my experiences of just people being like, so and so has had some LSD, that they're not, you know, they're not coping, um, you know, what can we do, you know, like when you're in your 20s, and you know, the whole basis of my qualification for doing this was that I'd taken LSD a couple of times, you know, and people like, I was like, well, ask Sam, he's, you know, so it would be nice to come to these things with something that helps you be confident. You need to be, you know, sort of confident in what you're doing, because you need to be calm. You can't be giving off any signals that are, because even though someone could be having a really intense psychedelic experience, um, it would be a mistake to think that they're also not capable of being extremely observant and picking up on very, very subtle cues from you, so subtle that they might not be even able to verbalize it or verbalize why. And when we talk about, in psychedelic experiences, how people pick up on each other's energy, it's like, I am agnostic about whether or not, I don't know if there's really some other kind of energy that people are picking up on, or if it's just that you're in a state where because the filters are kind of taken off your ability to see and hear things. You can just pick up a real lot from other people. So when you're sitting for someone who's having a hard time, you've got to be confident, you have to be calm, you have to be grounded, you have to be empathetic, but also your experience of empathy can't be something that affects you so much that it starts to affect how you are outwardly. And I think that's where I know that I kind of struggle with that, because if someone's having a really bad time and I start to empathize with them, and even if I'm not, even if I'm completely sober myself, I will start to, it will start to kind of amp up my emotions, and I know that I would have trouble. Like, I'm not going to be able to contain that well enough that they won't be able to pick up on it. And that's kind of a thing. I think, that's why I don't know that I'm totally suited to that. I could, I'm just not sure that that's what someone wants to hear. Someone's, having a really, really challenging journey, challenging experience, and they're like, oh, Sam, I'm having a really hard time. They don't want me to turn to them and say, well, yeah, so am I. I'm really scared.
Yes,
Yeah,
no,
I'm
you
scared.
don't.
I'm scared too. Yeah, no, that's not what. If I was having a bad experience, that is not what I would want to hear. So
No,
I think it's
no.
just in sitting with people, it's that, and then but the work before and after, that's something different again. For preparation and integration, it's familiarity with the experience, familiarity with these kind of what's a good process to prepare people going into it, but also not, and helping people work through things afterwards, but also not having a really preconceived notion of what a psychedelic experience is going to look like, or what, what preparing for it has to look like, or what integrating it has to look like. There's lots of different ways you can work through things. So it's not, I don't think it's formulaic. I don't think it can be. I don't think integrating a psychedelic experience can be just. It's not going to be a set thing. We're not going to, go and grab the. This isn't like grabbing a manual for other, psychological interventions. It's like, here we are. We're going to, not that any of them should be like that, but this is like, we're not just going to go, right, let's work through this thing and like go through the checklist. It's going to be. It has to be kind of very bespoke and different for each person. So it's good to, you need a lot of skill. You need to know a lot of different ways to approach how to integrate things, and have an open mind on what integration looks like for each new person that you work with, afterwards. And I think but that's also like, that's all mental health. It's like, what is, when you're working with someone, what are their aims? What does success look like for them? What does thriving look like for that person? Because it's about what it's like for them. It's not what you as the person treating them thinks it should look like. And I think that's, you got to be mindful of what you're sort of, you think they should be, you think they should have a job, you think they should have this sort of relationship, or live their life this sort of way. You can't be approaching it like that, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's kind of talking about like suggestibility as well, that when you're under that psychedelic experience, that, as you mentioned, kind of you're super sensitive and people can pick up different energies. And so if someone is nearby and, for example, makes a suggestion, I actually kind of saw this a little bit on the weekend with people that were out recreationally, clearly taking drugs. There was a bushfire not far from the festival, and you could see people getting anxious, and I mean, the bushfire was relatively close, but it was contained, apparently. And but you could hear people speaking about, the bushfire could get worse and could come and get us all, and almost like this spiral effect of our negative thought process, and how quickly that can have this domino effect in a group of people that are under the influence, because of the amount of suggestibility that occurs, because they're all under psychedelics. I mean, I presumed they were, because of the way in which their mannerisms were acting. I couldn't say what they were on, but that's the scary part about psychedelics, is that, you know, if we start to kind of transverse this landscape and we start to look at where is it going in the future and how can we bridge a gap between the medical industry and the recreational industry, ultimately the likelihood is there's always going to be a recreational industry. I think we have to be honest about it, right? And I think when you talk about integration, I mean, how many people listening that have taken psychedelics recreationally have ever gone, you know, day 1, day 7, day 14, and a month later and gone, oh, you know, that experience that I had, you know, at this festival, it did X, Y, and Z. Like, very few people self-reflect on what they're doing. And I suppose that's where I feel like that's more of that recreational. And I think the power of psychedelics is very large, but limited on a superficial experience where people just say, oh, this happened, this is what occurred. But then there's no aftermath of like, what does that do? Did it change? You know, so often people say, you know, it stopped them. They realized they didn't want to drink alcohol anymore, or they didn't want to smoke, or they wanted to eat better. You know, like how are we going to find this fine line, and how are we going to actually be able to educate people to get them to start to integrate and look at themselves more? Like, do you talk about that in kind of harm reduction and psychology and integration? Like, what do you suggest? Because it's not, no one's going to just all come through the medical industry, even if that's what we wanted.
No. I mean, and you're absolutely right. And this is a thing that I'd said. So what I was surprised actually that I got as good a reception for it as I did. I'd said on LinkedIn a while back that, you know, the mainstream of psychedelics isn't in clinical settings. It's not in therapists. Like, we know that. You know, give or take, you know, a few 100,000 people, we know that approximately, like in the last National Household Drug Survey, it was something like 1.6% of Australians over the age of 14 had used like some form of psychedelic in the past 12 months. Now, it's not a huge percentage, but actually that's a lot of people. Like, that's hundreds of thousands of people.
Yeah.
So hang on, my cat has just realized that I'm talking, and now I have to go and let him out of the office. Otherwise, he's just going to make a racket the whole time. So just
the cat might have a meaning.
He might have a meaning. He doesn't like it when I talk. You can see
he's like, be careful.
It's like you know, why
don't say too much, Sam.
But yeah, like the mainstream of psychedelics is in in uncontrolled, recreational, non-clinical settings. That is where most of it happens. Most of the psychedelic experiences happen, and I think we need to be really kind of, you know, we need to admit that and acknowledge that, and it's likely to stay that way probably for a really long time. I think people are coming around to the idea of integration. It's talked about so much more than it used to be. With the Psychedelic Society, we talk about it all the time. We, you know, sort of helping people prepare. Like, not everyone, this is the thing too, is that not everyone has an experience that, like, you might have an intention that you want to work with an experience, and then seek out ways to do that. But not everyone's going to, not everyone like feels the need to. Some people might have an experience and they haven't come to it with an intention that requires work afterwards, and they've had an experience and it was fun, and they don't really need to do any work. You know, they don't, like, they would benefit if they did work afterwards, but they don't need to, and that's fine. But also, you know, encouraging people to think about it if they do need to, or if they want to, connecting people with services now if they want to. And it's much more common now that there are, you know, the psychologists will advertise as offering, you know, integration services for people who had experiences where they need to do some, you know, where they want or need to do some work afterwards, you know, with someone who's you know, has, you know, that kind of psychological expertise. So I think it's coming around, and it would be cool because it's like just self-reflection is it's, you know, done well and done, I say well, if you done without being judgmental, like done with, you know, non-judgment, it's a really positive, useful thing, and both kind of personally but professionally. Like, it's reflective practice is a big part of lots of professions. It's a big, as you've probably come across, it's a big part of being a doctor. Like it's a big part of just when I read a bunch of papers about it a few years back, because I was working on something for my university about reflective practice in education, and this idea of something happened, and then we think about what happened, and then we'll kind of, well, in light of what happened and how I feel about it, well, what does that mean? And then that sort of loops back to your next experience. And that kind of loop of going from what happened and working through that and then coming back to your next experience and your life and what that means moving forward. Like there's a whole huge literature about that, what that means for how you train doctors and surgeons and teachers and things. So like it's a really positive kind of habit to get into, to go, oh, this happened. How do I feel about that? Well, yeah, what does this mean? And then just sit with it for a while and go, well, no, in light of, what happened and how I feel about it and what I thought, what does this mean for my life? What, if anything, does this mean for my life going forward? Maybe it means something. Maybe it means that there's a change that you might benefit from making, or that you might feel you want to try, or maybe it doesn't mean anything. Like this is sometimes there isn't a lesson. You can just have this experience, and it just is what it is, and it doesn't suggest anything to you that you need to change about your life. But then sometimes it does. Like or it'll tell you something, and it's not necessarily a change that you have to make, but you become aware of something about yourself. And I think of a few years ago, I had an experience where wasn't even really in it, was sort of afterwards, and it was just almost the next morning, and just things floated into my brain. It's like just the thought. It's like I've done a lot of things purely on the basis that people told me I was good at them. Like that's my thing. That's the way to I know now that this is the way to. If someone wanted to manipulate me into doing something, they would say, Sam, oh, you're really good at that. You're really good at that. And I'll go, oh, of course, I'm really good at that. That's what I should be doing because I'm really good at that. And honestly, it was only a few years ago that I kind of really sort of became aware of that about myself. And a lot of things kind of, fell into place. And it wasn't necessarily something I had to, integrate. It wasn't something that needed to be worked through, but it was now something that I was aware of, and it changed how I approach things in the future. So the changes can be sort of subtle, but you need to be aware, of that, and then kind of have some sort of intentional commitment to taking them forward if they seem, like the kind of thing that would benefit from that.
Is there any like particular tools of integration that you like? Because obviously journaling or speaking to a psychedelic assisted therapist, psychologist, but is there any like self-regulatory tools that you really like or share when people have had psychedelics and they're trying to integrate their experience?
Look, I think it's different for everyone. I know what works for me. I know, like, I don't journal consistently. I kind of a binge write. Like I don't feel the need to write all the time. If I feel the need to write, on a daily basis, I know that there's a lot going on with me. But there's some experiences where I've really felt the need to write them down and then leave it and then come back to it a few months later, weeks or months later or years later and go, what does that even mean? Yeah. And so that's kind of how I've approached it. But also things like practicing mindfulness, and more recently things that I've gotten into, kind of self-compassion practice mindfulness, but really being big on the, going easy on yourself, being non-judgmental, approaching things from a kind of a really non-judgmental space, and allowing yourself to feel your feelings first before you, sort of work out what you're going to do in light of that. And then just, those sort of mindfulness practices, or a lot of things like that. I mean, I used to do body scan meditation all the time, which works for some people but not for others. And I'm kind of reluctant to recommend things specifically because it's just different for people. Some people find these things really helpful. Some people find these things, really unhelpful. It's just something that I think you just need to give people a lot of options and then try a lot of different things and work out what works for them. Because, you know, some people like to do art, some people like to do visual things, some people need to work through things very physically, and a lot of people find, I mean, a lot of people find yoga helpful as kind of as a sort of a mindful practice, and this kind of really embodied mindful practice that they can sort of work through stuff, as you know, through their yoga practice. That's not what I do, but I know other people find it helpful. And I know there is the beginnings of research around kind of potential interactions between yoga and psychedelic experiences, or yoga and microdosing. As there is a little bit of work that's starting to be done around that, which kind of indicates that there's maybe a good crossover there.
Well, I mean, when we look at things like yoga and pranayama, which is breath work, which is part of the yogic philosophy, it's not just asanas, it's not yoga, it's not just movement, right? So if you look at like yogic philosophy, and it's all about non-attachment and unity and peace, and ultimately trying to get to this place of samadhi, which is that beautiful oneness that you feel often in corpse pose, shavasana, when you've finished a good yoga session and suddenly you're like, I don't feel like I need to breathe, I don't feel like I need to move, and you're just there. I think that feeling has been scientifically shown and proven that that's when we produce a lot of DMT. So in our pranayama, and in that kind of feeling that you get, a lot of people have associated that with when they take different psychedelics that form DMT in our brains. Because we know that DMT is obviously endogenous, it's inside us anyway, but then there's active substances that we can take that can escalate that feeling. And for me, certainly, like, you know, you mentioned a few things, but like for me, certainly dance and singing and movement is a very embodying practice that I find very useful. But I agree, everyone's different, and I feel that probably one of the biggest thing that connects a lot of people in the psychedelic industry is a feeling of nature, or less. There's less needed less needed in superficial things, in money, in materialism, in the way that we look, and actually just kind of like our core is all that's required. And so when we can get back to ourselves and we can embody who we are and our soul, and forget that we're just in these meat suits, I find that people tend to feel very relaxed and are able to integrate better. But I completely agree. Whatever works for one person may be slightly different for another. I love chatting to you, Dr. Sam. You've obviously done some incredible work in the arena and continuing to do stuff. I know that you've got a few really awesome projects potentially on the horizon. You're looking potentially into making some products that might come through one day. Hey?
You know, maybe. I think it's early days, you know, for the industry.
I won't spill the beans then.
Yeah. I think it's I'm hoping that I really, you know, I think it's really important to me, like how I think a lot about how like kind of psychedelics can kind of emerge, and how they can kind of be part of like a lot of, I mean, I think it's safe to say that there's probably some changes that like all of us kind of as a society, you know, we should probably make. And how we think about psychedelics, and how we think about plant medicines, other plant medicines, whether they're psychedelic or not, how we think about altered states and health, and what it means to sort of, what does it mean to thrive? What does it mean to flourish as humans? You know, and how we relate to the world. You know, psychedelics kind of tie into all of this. So I think it's important to, I don't know, it's important to help, you know, good people who are coming, you know, into the space with good intentions, and to try and do something good. I think it's important to help them succeed, and that's really what I'm hoping to do going forward. I always have a few, you know, I always have projects kind of coming around the corner, but I can never talk about any of them until they've actually public.
Landed.
So, you know, there's a book that I'm supposed to be helping edit soon. That's, you know, really interesting, kind of on the in the psychedelic space. I have a couple of articles that should be coming out soon through Psychedelics Today. I've done some writing for them. should be published soon. I hope they don't mind me saying it, but I know they're on their way now. Yeah, so there's things like that. There's always more educational resources and things to do for different organizations. It's just have to sort of see. But yeah, it's a really exciting time here in Australia for this, to see things open up and to actually work with. I've spent years working with people overseas and not in Australia, because there's always just been more call for what I've been doing. Particularly sort of Oregon and California, where most of my clients have been so far. But now they might be here, and that's really exciting to kind of see what might be coming out of the changes that we're having now. But I'll keep doing that, and in my spare time I'll keep plugging away at trying to sort of loosen up and reform the laws around these things, and I guess we just have to see where all of it goes.
Well, I'm so glad that we've got like a magical wizard on our side, trying to help change policies and educate, and allowing us to just have these open discussions. As I said to anyone in the audience, currently all psychedelics are illegal in Australia. So this is not a plug to go and take a load of psychedelics, but it's a way in which we can start to actually be truthful about what's occurring out there in the world, and not just keep hiding it. And if people have decided that they're going to do something, to at least try and do things safely, and there are resources. And there are psychologists and psychedelic-assisted therapists that are around. So please be reassured that we're trying to make headway, and we've got some great people behind the scenes like Dr. Sam that are doing great things. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today, and I'm sure we'll keep chatting.
Me. Yeah, no thank you for having me. It's been really great. I could talk forever, but we should.
I know. I love it.
You're not down for some sort of like really like Joe Rogan length, like marathon 4 hours, discussion.
Why don't we go to a legal country where we could take the psychedelics, and then we could actually have like a 24-hour conversation about it. Maybe.
But yes. No, it's been really, really lovely talking to you.
Yes.
I'll do it again anytime.
And you, awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Sam.